So I'm sitting here on a pretty hot day, but drinking some delicious Brazilian drinking chocolate out of a Brazilian cup made by the wonderful Juliana. And I'm just thinking how lucky I am, not just to have gone to Brazil, but just how lucky we are that Brazil is undergoing this extraordinary renaissance of craft chocolate. If you go back to late 1989, the world's first example of bioterrorism occurred in Bahia, where witch's broom was deliberately introduced to try and alert people to the terrible conditions of many of the workers out there. It was a catastrophic own goal. It was just a disaster because it destroyed cocoa in Bahia. Yields went down from over 380,000 tons to less than 100,000 in a decade. And it just bankrupted farms, destroyed the livelihoods of farmers. And yet since then, we've seen an extraordinary renaissance. And that's what we're going to try and talk about in the upcoming videos. It's an extraordinary renaissance which isn't just from the farmers and from the farm workers. It isn't just about genetics. It's also about social activities that people have been pursuing. And it's also about some top-down support and how people have been working. And that's what I'm going to try and run through. And you're going to basically hear everything from like how you've got round fermentation vents instead of the square ones. You've got anaerobic fermentation. You've got amazing drying techniques. You've also got football pitches and schools being set up to try and encourage people to go back. And then you've got extraordinary new technologies being developed at Setback and CIC by people like Adriana. So join me as I run you through a few of those and show you some videos from my amazing trip. And thanks enormously to Juliana, to Raul Tavares and Rogerio from Estico for just being such wonderful hosts. Let's start by talking about how farmers have responded to this. So farmers were absolutely destroyed. I mean, you talk to someone like Juliana and she will, with tears in her eyes, describe the challenges her father had. I mean, this is like, multi-generational farm where they've basically been working with people for over 50 to 100 years in families' cases. Now they're coming back, and they're coming back because these farms and these farmers have done an amazing job of looking at new cocoa varietals which are disease resistant, but they also just taste fantastic. So when you go around a farm in Bahia, be prepared for a cornucopia, for an absolute feast of different cocoa varietals, which they will proudly show you. And you can taste them, and you can see the difference, like the different seeds that you can see, and often they're cross-mingled within a pod, but the different pulps you get too are just staggering. We did this with Rogerio, we did this with Juliana, we did this with Raul, and it's just extraordinary, the variety of different cocos which are being grown there. And they're very, very carefully grafted to make certain that they know that they're going to be disease resistant, but also so they can test them to see what flavors you can pull out of them.
So what we're seeing is basically the bottom of the tree, that's where it was originally in Amelando, and then above it you've cloned to Bonanza because it resists witch's broom.
So that's one example of how the farmers are really, really grappling back. But they've also explored all sorts of new techniques and approaches. So for example, a little bit like the UK, it rains a lot in Bahia. And so when you're drying the cocoa beans, you have to think about it very differently. And if you look on the below, you'll see some videos of us all basically in the rain, and you'll notice that Raul and I don't have hats on or anything else because it's good Brazilian Englishmen. But also what you'll see is some really, really innovative approaches. So rather than just covering up the top very as quickly as they possibly can, they've also thought about the fact that if you want to dry the beans effectively, you want some side currents. And so they basically designed techniques and approaches there. And then they've also got second stage drying, which works in different ways. And again, look at the videos to understand that a bit more. But it's not just drying, it's not just beans, it's also in the fermentation. So taking a leaf out of the wine industry, Raul Tavares basically realized that if you've got square boxes, that can be a bit of a challenge because basically in the corners, it's going to be a different temperature as you ferment the beans to other parts. And so he basically pioneered the idea of using round, almost like wine barrels to ferment the cacao. And they are extraordinary to watch. And if you look at Rogerio is also using these barrels. He's using a slightly different sort of barrel, much smaller. It's about 25 kgs. that helps the theft. But the other thing he's doing, which is extraordinarily innovative, is that, as you know, when you ferment cacao, you start by getting anaerobic, and then you normally have an aerobic fermentation after that. Now, he's managed to avoid that by basically just having the whole way through. And if you look at the video, that little bottle you can see, and those little bubbles, that's the CO2 coming through. And this sort of fermentation means that you get less heat, but it also means that you get a completely different flavor profile. So do try them and just, explore how it's going. So what's happening here is, bubbling up is all this creativity from these amazing farmers as to what they're doing with genetics, with fermentation, with drying, etc. On the farm, it's not just cocoa genetics though. It's not just what's happening with different fermentation approaches. They've also realized that there's a fundamental problem here, which is that it's not just hard work to be a cocoa farmer, but also you have to do it sometimes quite a way away from the bright lights in the big cities. So Juliana, Rogerio, Hal, all the other farmers out there are really trying to think about different ways to address this. So Brazil loving football, they've all got football pitches close to their farms, which the kids can play on. But above and beyond that, and much more seriously, they've also got schools which they're investing in. And Juliana's got this amazing school, which when you go to Juliana's, you absolutely have to go and visit. Not just that, they're also thinking innovatively about how do they incentivize the farmers to become entrepreneurs themselves. So, for example, there are lots of systems by which the farmers themselves will get, splitting with their workers, 40 to 60% of the beans and the harvests. And it's a very clever way to incentivize people and get people to sort of work the right way. And then they also all work together to look at things like cabruca. So cabruca is the traditional way that you look at canopy and the different trees and the different plants to try and help the different cocoa varietals to grow, because cocoa obviously needs shade and it also needs lots of humidity. And this is where, again, you start to see the amazing way in which farmers and the institutions will coordinate. So, for example, one of the challenges with any soil is how do you get nitrogen in it? And so scientists will often tell you that you need trees which will do that. So there's a very famous tree, Erichinea. If you look at pictures of Bahia, you often see these amazing purple plants. That's often Erichinea. This was introduced, very smart idea, but it's got a practical problem, which is that tree grows very fast, but it also snaps very easily in tropical rainstorms, and when it snaps, it destroys all the cocoa plants. So, interesting idea, good try, didn't quite work, but they're going back to the drawing board. And next, we're going to talk a little bit about how these institutions are working and what they're doing to help them. Bahia is blessed with a number of really great cocoa institutions and initiatives. So, for example, there's one amazing one which we went to, Adriana Seplak, where we tried this extraordinary variety of different cacaos, and she's just wonderful at introducing you to that. But she also knows the challenges there too. Adriana and her team have developed this extraordinary computer vision system. Now, they did this before they had AI, so it took them a lot of work to do. But basically, when they do a cut test now, they can speed it up hugely because they can basically stick it into a machine. And I think going forward, you're really going to see a lot more of this sort of activity. And it wouldn't amaze me that Adriana's already working on it and using AI to do this. That's not the only example of innovative approach that Adriana uses. Adriana is incredibly focused on flavor, very proud of the work she does with Cocoa of Excellence. And she's really sort of, thought this through. So, for example, when she gets her staff to taste cacao, because you have this enormous variety of different colors of the seeds, everything from white through to light brown through to dark brown, she's very conscious of the fact that may influence the way people think about the testing which they're doing. And so what she's done is she has red lights. So it's rather strange. It's sort of walking into a disco almost when you walk into some of her tasting rooms. And it's because this avoids people being prejudiced as to how they think about tasting. It's not just Seplak too. CIC does some amazing work in what it does and how it thinks about it. And, hats off to the team there for what they're doing with diseases, how they're monitoring it, its spread, controlling it as best they can, but they're really, really trying to stay on top of what's going on there. The final area I'd really like to talk about is the attempts to communicate and get people to understand what cacao is all about. So just as Napa wineries have done an amazing job of educating Americans and tourists to America about what wine can be, This is starting to happen in Bahia too. So we went to a number of different farms where literally they're farming cacao, but they're showing people as they do it, and they've got really great businesses which are built around the experiences. And you can see this, for example, when you go to Juliana's, but you can see this in some of the other farms too. They'll tell you the history, they'll show you every step of it, they'll show you the round fermentation boxes too, and they'll then also take you through a tasting and an exploration. And it's wonderful not just to see the pride, but also just to see how people, when they're exposed to this, actually get much more, not just about why this is an amazing crop, not just about how this is an amazing crop, but how you can just savor and delight in the flavor. So hats off to Brazil, and I can't wait to go back there soon.